I almost don't recognize the voice that comes out of me when I call them. Thin, urgent, the kind that has lived on nothing but adrenaline and bad coffee for 3 sleepless days. Please, I say, and there's that stupid little laugh that happens when you're trying not to cry. Maya needs surgery. A congenital valve issue. If we don't get her on the schedule next week, it gets worse. I tell them the hospital, the surgeon's name, the number for the patient advocate. I tell them what I've already done. Maxed cards, sold my old equipment, borrowed from friends. I tell them the thing no parent wants to have to say out loud. I don't have the money. They are Charles and Marianne Whitmore, my parents, polished and private, ranch estate realtors who have a trust fund and a taste for obscure Bordeaux. When I was a kid, their backyard had a koi pond and a gardener who showed up more reliably than any father figure. They're not cruel people, not in the way a villain in a movie is cruel. No smoking gun, no deleted evil voicemail. Their cruelty is procedural and precise. Priorities sorted, spreadsheets closed, compassion delegated to charity galas. There's a pause on the other end long enough for me to feel my pulse in my throat. Then Marianne inhales, the way she always does before she says something gentle but final. "Katie," she says, "you know we love you, but we can't." And I wait for the but to land, the soft pivot that will make this bearable. Ethan has been planning his engagement celebration for months. He's going all out. $250,000 private vineyard, fireworks. The family is already committed. You should have thought about saving earlier. You've made choices that haven't been wise. Ethan, my brother, thin, immaculately groomed, the kind of man whose apartment is photographed in lifestyle spreads between seltzer ads and preppy menswear. He's engaged to Olivia Grant, who posts yoga poses that look like impossible metal sculptures and captions like manifestation, fake TW. Somehow, my daughter's life has become a footnote next to an event that will be the most photographed night of Ethan's life. $250,000? I repeat, because it sounds like a made-up number when measured against the thing that actually matters. I say the figure slowly, as if I will sound ridiculous enough to make them change their minds. I tell them what the surgeon said. Early intervention, not optional, a risk if delayed. I try to make them understand that this is not a loan I'm asking for. This is a medical imperative. Marianne's voice goes cool and small, like a vase betrayed by a chip. We can't enable poor financial decisions, Katie. We've helped before. You need to be responsible. Charles clears his throat. He always clears for effect, and adds, "We have commitments. Ethan's guests expect a certain standard. There is no outrage in it, only the practical logistics of disappointment and benefit." I hear other sounds then. The low clink of crystal, maybe, or the distant murmur of a voice that belongs to a life where people can buffer tragedy with event planners and couture. Somewhere in the house they're discussing linens or RSVPs while my chest hollows as though someone scooped it out. I hang up and stand in the kitchen like someone who has walked into the wrong film. Maya is asleep on the couch upstairs, her breath shallow but regular, a small, stubborn presence against the ocean of possibilities that could save her. My hands shake when I cup her face. "I'm going to fix this," I whisper, "because what else do you say to a child?" The words sound like a promise and an accusation all at once. What I don't tell them, because they have never wanted to hear me as anything but the sum of my errors, is that my life is not a string of bad choices. I run a small design business. I work long nights, take jobs that mean I can keep a roof over our heads, and I am the person who teaches Maya to tie shoes and to find the humor in hospital gowns. I am asking my parents for a bridge loan so my daughter can keep living. It is not a bailout for my lifestyle. It is a plea for a life. They don't see it that way. To them, my request is a ledger item. Risk versus reward, reputation versus cost. I can hear Ethan's laughter in the lines they smooth around their words. I can feel my past mistakes, some real, some inflated to justify their indifference, shimmering behind every excuse they offer. When the call ends, it's not with a slammed door, but with that kind of polite silence that says the decision has already been made. I am left holding a phone and a number and a small, sleeping girl whose chest rises and falls in a rhythm that could stop. The house feels suddenly too large, an empty set for a life I thought I belonged to, but apparently never paid for. I leave a voicemail for every appropriate hospital contact and then start making lists. Lists are a thing I can control when the world feels like a tilt. Lists let me move, even if what I can move is only paper. But I am also aware of a new, hot ember of something else, an anger that flares when someone chooses spectacle over a beating heart. It is quiet and terrible, and it settles into my bones like cold steel. This is the moment, when one door is slammed by people who were supposed to hold it open, that the whole story begins. I drove to their house before I called, because if I was going to ask for anything at that point, I wanted to see the faces that would say yes or no. Tom and Denise lived in a split level that smelled like wood polish and strong coffee, the kind of home with photographs in mismatched frames and a stack of National Geographics that never quite made it to the recycling. Tom opened the door with his winter coat still on, that same graceless hug he gives everyone. And Denise wiped her hands on a dish towel like she'd been mid-recipe. They are the sort of people who show up with a casserole when someone is sick and then stay to help you do the dishes. I didn't have to explain the numbers to them twice. I had a stack of estimates and an organizer's sense of how to ask for help without asking too much. I'd told them what my parents had said, how they'd chosen lights and linens over my daughter's life, and I watched both their faces go quiet in that particular way people do when they're calculating how much love costs in the currency they have. "Show me the estimate," Tom said. He never used much more language than he needed. Denise, on the other hand, sat at the kitchen table and didn't look at the papers. She just said, "We'll do it." They sold the retirement cabin. It's a small sentence that still breaks me when I say it, because that cabin was their plan. Late mornings with fishing poles, a creaky dock that smelled like sun-warmed wood, and the kind of calm people buy when they can finally afford to breathe. They'd been saving for that quiet for years. I watched Denise sign the papers at a table we'd eaten at many times, and Tom's hand trembled when he handed me the cashier's check. They didn't speak like people making a sacrifice. They spoke like people deciding who their family was and choosing. Maya's surgery day is a day I keep like a photograph behind glass. The waiting room smelled of coffee and the kind of disinfectant that tries too hard. Denise paced like a spring wound too tight. Tom sat silent, thumbs worrying the seam of a leather chair. I had already learned that hospitals have a soft grammar of hope. Kind nurses with names you remember for the wrong reasons. A surgeon with a surprisingly steady laugh. When the surgeon finally came out, there was a pause that felt like holding your breath underwater. "We fixed her," he said, simple and enormous. I laughed then, half cry, half sob, because the thing I'd been most afraid of was the sound of a sentence that could fracture me. "She's stronger than we thought," he added, "and she'll need time, but the operation went well." After, when Maya was asleep and the machines hummed a steady lullaby, I sat with Denise and Tom and we drank vending machine coffee that tasted like betrayal and relief. Tom kept making these small, gruff motions, quiet jokes about my hospital fashion choices. Denise fussing over blankets like she was tucking away another person's child into her own chest. They wouldn't let me call it charity. "Family doesn't keep score," Denise said, and I believed her. It felt in that moment like being given the world back in manageable pieces. I vowed then, out loud, because vows are stronger if you say them, never to be that exposed again. Not because I stopped needing help, but because I hated the feeling of having to beg for the right to keep my child alive. I poured the rest of my fear into work. Winter's design studio had been a side hustle and a late-night obsession. It became my engine. I reworked the website in a week, rebranded our pitch decks, and started taking jobs I would have once turned down because they required nerve I hadn't thought I had. Sleep became negotiable. Bad coffee became a badge of honor. The business didn't fix the hollow left by how my parents had chosen spectacle over flesh, but it gave me leverage, a place where slowly I could build the kind of autonomy that doesn't need permission. By the time Maya came home, bandaged and stubbornly cheerful, Winters was no longer just survival. It was a promise that if anyone else ever tried to stake a claim on my vulnerability, I'd have somewhere to stand. Tom and Denise boxed up the last of the cabin maps and gave them to Maya as something of a future inheritance. When she's older, Tom grumbled, but his eyes were soft. I took them and put them in my desk, a quiet reminder that kindness, when it shows up, is not performative. It is the kind of currency you spend on what matters. By the time Winter's design studio stopped feeling like a desperate late-night scramble and started feeling like a thing that might actually survive me, I'd learned how to hold two contradictory truths at once. Grief can be a fuel, and success can be a wound dressed in silk. We landed our first major contract, the kind that makes your inbox rearrange itself, a multi-property redesign for a boutique hotel group that wanted a warm, honest modernity across 10 locations. I remember the email subject line like it was a movie title. Winters X North and Harbor. Partnership proposal. I sat on the floor of my studio with Maya tucked under my knee and cried. Not because the money had arrived, but because the world had finally decided to listen. Hiring came next. 2 junior designers I found on late-night portfolio dives, an office manager who could make invoices speak like people, and a part-time contractor who knew how to make our slow website finally behave like it wanted to be found. We moved from the cramped, paint-splattered room I'd been renting by the hour to a corner office with enough natural light that I started keeping plants alive out of spite. The first payroll I ran without having to choose which bills to push felt obscene and holy at once. With growth came attention. It starts small, a shout-out from a curator, a feature in a local design blog, then amplifies like feedback. An editor at Entrepreneur reached out after a client mentioned our work in passing during an interview. "We love companies with a mission," she wrote. "Tell us your story." I almost didn't answer because the last thing I wanted was to be the spectacle my parents loved to avoid. But I kept thinking about that cashier's check Tom handed me, the way Denise's hands trembled over paperwork that had been their quiet dream. I kept thinking about Maya's small chest under bandages, the way a beating heart can be reduced to a line item for people who never had to keep score. The piece ran as a profile. Katie Winters, founder of Winters Design Studio, how a single mother rebuilt a life and a business from a hospital room and a pile of unpaid invoices. It ran with a photograph of me I hated, smiling too hard, right hair in a bun, coffee ring on my sleeve. But I wrote the piece the way I'd learned to write invoices. Clear, unadorned, no room for misinterpretation. I told the truth about the surgery, about Tom and Denise selling the cabin, and I told the truth about Charles and Marianne refusing to help. I'd rehearsed the part about not being dramatic. I'd practiced the sentence that wasn't a condemnation, but a statement of fact. When my daughter needed urgent surgery, my parents chose my brother's engagement party instead. I expected a flinch. I expected sympathy. I did not expect the speed at which social currency would reroute itself. People like to think that high society is impermeable, that reputations act like impenetrable stone. They're wrong. Reputation is paper and gossip is wind. Within days, our inboxes filled with messages, some from clients thanking us for speaking up, some from strangers offering to commission work, a few from old classmates whose tone suggested a realignment of loyalties. Local charity boards that had once sought Marianne's name for gala committees quietly removed it. The country club where Charles played doubles stopped returning his calls. Ethan's engagement vendors, friends in the event world who'd been on retainer, started emailing gentle, regretful notes. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we must withdraw. Olivia, who'd been a social media fixture of curated smiles, began losing followers by the thousands. Her engagement announcement thread, once a neat cascade of hearts, curdled into a public argument about privilege and neglect. I watched it happen with that weird mix of vindication and queasy unease. Justice, even in small amounts, is messy. I had not set out to ruin anyone. I had set out to tell the truth so other people wouldn't have to ration their children's lives. But truth is not harmless. It rearranges tables. It makes people find out who they really sat beside. The hardest part was watching Ethan try to manage the fallout. He called 3 times in 1 week, each call more polished than the last. "Katie, I didn't appreciate how the article painted things," he said on the second. "Can we talk privately? For the family?" He sounded as if he had rehearsed humility in front of a mirror. On the third call, he asked if I would ask the magazine to remove that line about the engagement party. He pitched it like a negotiation over artful phrasing, not a child's high-stakes operation. I told him no. I told him that silence had been my cost for years, and I had finally earned the right to be heard. He said I was cruel. I said I was honest. He asked if I had to make enemies to make a point. I told him about Tom and Denise signing away their cabin, and how that sacrifice had never been intended as a ledger item. That didn't make him call less. It only hardened the shapes of his defenses. There were costs for me, of course. Old friends who kept their distance, clients who feared drama, gossip that showed up at the oddest hours. There were nights I lay awake, thinking about the moment my parents had chosen spectacle over my child, and wondering if there had been a different way. But there was also a letter from a woman in Cincinnati whose son had needed surgery 2 years earlier. She wrote that our story gave her the courage to ask for help, and that she'd found a donor. There were invitations to speak on panels about women-led businesses and resilience. There were small things, like a neighbor bringing over 2 casseroles after a long week and the sound of Maya laughing in the next room. The world had shifted. My parents' world had shrunk. Mine had extended. I wasn't celebrating that. I'm not that kind of person. But I felt something like settling. The line I'd drawn by telling the truth had consequences for others, messy and real, and sometimes painful. But it also meant I had made a choice about the kind of person I wanted to be, someone who would not let the story end in silence. That decision set off a chain that I couldn't have predicted. Doors opened, some I'd never known existed, and some doors closed with final, polite clicks. It felt, in a way, like moving from winter into a cautious spring. There was hope, yes, but also a sharpness. The memory of refusal sat like a stone in my pocket, a weight I used to steady myself as we grew. They came on a Tuesday like a pair of weathered postcards. Charles with his tie loosened, Marianne with the polite, rehearsed smile that has never quite reached her eyes. They rang the bell on the studio door, and I felt something old and small tighten in my chest. It had been years. Winters had grown into something steady. Maya was taller and sharper and more likely to correct my posture than I was. And Tom and Denise had stopped making sacrifice feel like a headline and just kept showing up like the quiet gravity they were. They asked to speak in my office. I let them in. The room still smelled faintly of paint and lemon oil, the same furniture that had been there the night I decided this place would be more than a scrappy survival project. They sat across from me, 2 halves of a life I'd once tried to fit into, and the air between us felt absurdly as formal as a parlor. "We," Charles started, and then stopped, as if he were testing the temperature on a phrase. Marianne's hands folded in that small, exact way she'd always had, and the practiced cadence of their sentences arrived like a draft. Apologies smoothed into confessions, explanations dressed as facts. They spoke of bad investments, an international developer who disappeared with deposits, a tax miscalculation, a lawsuit they'd thought would settle quietly. They spoke in the passive voice of people who were used to being insulated from consequence. "We didn't mean," Marianne said. "We never meant for it to come to this." She tried to make it sound accidental, like poverty had been a misdelivered package rather than a result of choices. She told me the numbers. The house was mortgaged in ways I hadn't known. The credit lines maxed, the winery stake they'd thought would cushion retirement gone. They were, by their accounting, right at the edge of insolvency. What they didn't say, what they didn't need to say because their faces made it clear, was that this was the same family calculus they'd used when Maya needed a surgeon. They asked for help now with the same quiet expectation they'd maintained for decades, as if filial duty was a revolving credit line. I listened the way you listen to something you already know the ending of, with a strange mixture of relief that the truth had finally arrived and fury that it had been delayed until it suited them. "How much?" I asked. Charles glanced at Marianne, then produced a folded sheet with an accountant's neat columns. $150,000 to settle immediate creditor claims and stave off foreclosure and bankruptcy proceedings long enough to reorganize. It was surprising how small, in the end, the number looked on paper. Less than Ethan's engagement, less than a single season of the charity galas they used to host. It had the odd quality of being both monumentally large and quietly, embarrassingly small. I didn't hesitate, because by then hesitation felt performative and petty. I wrote a check for $150,000 from the business account. The money Tom and Denise and I had turned into an engine that paid salaries, covered rent, and most importantly, kept our roofs over our heads. The pen felt heavy in my hand, a weight that carried all the inventory of the last 10 years. The late nights, the invoices chased down, the surgeries, Tom and Denise's sold cabin, Maya's nights at the hospital. I signed, crossed the T's, and slid the check across the desk. They cried then, quietly, the kind of grief that comes from fear being translated into currency. Marianne's hand covered mine for a breath that felt like an apology and a prayer all in one. Charles's voice broke when he tried to say thank you. They told me they had been wrong. About many things. They asked if I would come back to the family, to holidays, to the old rhythms. I'd expected relief, maybe a small staged reconciliation. Instead, something in me had been altered by the years of choosing. The check was not charity. It was a clean ledger, an act that allowed them to keep what remained without bleeding into me again. I had learned the difference between helping and being taken for granted. I had learned that generosity without boundaries breeds the exact sort of complacency that had once put my child at risk. "Take it," I said, and my voice was steady in a way I had not often allowed. But listen to me very carefully. I laid out the terms, not legalese, but moral lines that needed to be drawn. No more requests, no more expectations that I would be the safety net for choices they continued to make. "We are done," I told them, and I felt the words land like a hinge clicking shut. "You will accept this, and then we will not be anything more than what we are, acquaintances who share a history." Marianne tried to argue, soft pleas about family, about forgiveness. Charles looked like a man bargaining with the wind. I cut them off gently and with all the clarity I had been practicing for years. "You taught me how to prioritize spectacle," I said. "I'm teaching myself how to prioritize people. That includes me and includes Maya. From this point forward, you are not my parents in the way you were before. You are Charles and Marianne Whitmore. I will not be your daughter." The shock on their faces was not theatrical. It was the slow, incredulous ache of people who had always assumed roles would never be refused. I watched Marianne's shoulders slump as if someone had removed the shoulders from under a coat she'd always worn. Charles, who had always believed a smooth voice could fix everything, went quiet in the way that finally shows you where a man's true center lies. I walked them to the door after they had accepted the check because the conversation had to end somewhere physical. We stood on the stoop of the studio and the afternoon was clear and cold. Marianne touched my arm once, an impulsive, human motion that had nothing to do with their prior calculations, and left. They drove away with a few boxes, their posture oddly small in a car that once symbolized their place in a larger world. I turned the key in the studio door and felt for the first time in a long while lightness that was not the kind that comes from vindication. It was steadier, quieter, the relief of someone who had set a boundary and kept it. The money would buy them a chance. My refusal to be their daughter would, I hoped, buy my family, my chosen family, some peace. That night, I called Tom and Denise first, because they'd been the ones to teach me what family could actually look like. Tom grunted when he picked up, which is his way of smiling. "You did the thing," he said. Denise laughed, warm and surprised, and told me Maya had drawn a picture of the three of us at a picnic, with a tiny canoe in the corner. I put the phone down and looked at the city from my office window. The skyline was a scatter of lights, some distant, some close, and I thought of how we choose where to stand in that view. Giving them exactly what they needed without giving them me felt like justice and like mercy all at once. It was a payment, not a pardon. And as I unlocked the door to the studio the next morning, I felt like someone who had finally learned how to be unambiguous about who she would protect and why. There's a photo on my mantle that nobody ever posed for. Tom took it one Sunday when we were all too busy laughing to notice. Maya, now 13 and all elbows and wild hair, is holding a paintbrush like a sword. Denise is mid-laugh, holding a bowl of strawberries. Mark, steady, unflappable Mark, the man who somehow wandered into my life when I wasn't looking for anyone, has an arm draped lazily over my shoulder. I'm looking at them all with that unguarded softness people don't realize they're capable of until they've lost enough to recognize peace when it sits beside them. That's my family. No marble foyers, no invitations gilded with our last names, no inherited estates, just people who show up when you need them to, even if it costs them something. After my parents left that day, they kept their silence. I didn't check to see how their lives unfolded. I heard things secondhand: a downsized condo, a quiet move to a smaller town, Ethan's engagement unraveling once the trust fund that fed it ran dry. But I stopped letting those stories rent space in my head. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't mean rebuilding what was destroyed. Sometimes it means leaving the ruins intact as proof you survived the fire. Winter's design studio kept growing. Not explosively, not with the dizzy chaos of viral success, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of something built to last. We started mentoring small businesses run by single parents. We sponsored art classes at the children's hospital that once saved Maya. When I walked through those halls years later, I could still smell the antiseptic and fear. But this time, it didn't crush me. It reminded me that the world can be rebuilt, one stubborn breath at a time. Tom and Denise come over every Friday. Tom insists on bringing dessert, usually something questionable from the grocery bakery, and Denise pretends she doesn't love my overcooked lasagna. Mark hums while he loads the dishwasher, and Maya rolls her eyes in the way only a teenager who's deeply loved can. When I see them together, these people who have no blood in common but share everything that matters, I realize I never lost a family. I just had to redefine it. One evening after everyone had gone home, I sat by the window with a glass of wine and thought about that phone call from years ago. The one where my parents chose fireworks over a heartbeat. For a long time, that memory was a wound I couldn't stop pressing. Now it feels like an origin story. Without that moment, I might never have known the difference between people who love you for what you are and those who love you for what you give. Maya came downstairs halfway through my reverie, still in her paint-streaked sweatshirt. "Mom," she said, "you look happy." "I am," I told her. And I meant it. Not the brittle, performative kind of happiness you tell yourself to survive, but the grounded, ordinary kind that doesn't need to be posted or proved. She sat beside me, her head against my shoulder, the rhythm of her breathing soft and certain. Outside, the city lights blinked in their own quiet language. This is the part of the story where if it were a movie, the music would swell and fade. But in real life, it just keeps going. Laughter in the kitchen, the hum of the dishwasher, a girl who lived, a woman who learned, and a family that never needed matching last names to feel whole. And that, I think, is all the revenge I ever needed.